Hey, well, what's up, guys? Welcome back to The Collision. Daniel here to talk about Angel Studios' new kind of movie, TV show, hybrid, Homestead. I have seen it, so let's talk about it. So let's be totally honest that faith-based entertainment has come a very long way from, the dark days of being just hokey Hollywood knockoffs baptized in very heavy-handed religious messages. I think not only have faith-based films established themselves as legitimate, cinematic genre, but many have blazed, I think, new, very innovative trails in the industry. And that is definitely true of Angel Studios' latest offering, Homestead, which does kind of go boldly into uncharted Hollywood territory as a very unique kind of theatrical film, television show hybrid. Although whether or not that very ambitious approach will pay off probably depends on just audience expectations. I think, Homestead's gritty aesthetic and intriguing world building do make a very compelling start to the streaming show, even if it is, I think, a largely unsatisfying as a standalone theatrical movie. And we'll get into that release strategy in just a second, but kind of in addition to, the hybrid release, I think Homestead also just sets itself apart with its sort of high concept premise, and it's more I think unusually gritty and raw tone, at least, relative for a faith-based story. Because Angel Studios' 2023 film, The Shift, was a recent, rare example of a faith-based film venturing into the realms of imaginative fiction. But I think most of the genre has followed the much safer template as either being a direct biblical adaptation or a true life drama about the inspirational life of a Christian figure. And kind of in that context, I think Homestead is commendable for its willingness to just break the mold and explore Christian themes through a fictional story that has an aesthetic of, big dudes with big guns and a very, a world-building backdrop of a very, a post-apocalyptic society that is really unlike anything else in the genre. But I think it's important to point out that despite this being marketed very much as a feature film, Homestead is probably better understood as a very supersized pilot episode for a TV show, which will eventually be available to stream on the Angel Studios app. I think there are examples of popular shows that have spawned theatrical spin-offs Downton Abbey, but launching a TV show with a theatrical release is really almost unprecedented. For me, the only comparable that comes to mind is back in 2008, the animated Star Wars series The Clone Wars. And so even with a very extended runtime, Homestead very much is episode one of a show rather than being a self-contained narrative, because there's new characters and new subplots that are still being introduced well into the third act of this, and even the film's ending just lacks closure or a satisfying resolution. And the unique release strategy also just makes Homestead a challenge at times to evaluate, since it is only the first chapter in a much larger narrative. For example, there's one sort of eyebrow raising motif that I noticed, which is despite presenting itself with more of a traditionally masculine aesthetic, kind of in the mold of Amazon Prime's Wild the Reacher show, the film almost slants surprisingly feminine. And by that I mean there are about 3 or 4 kind of romantic married couples or boyfriend girlfriend or couples in this story, and in each case without exception, the woman is the strong-willed partner with a steadfast faith who, must condescend to the hot-headed, stubborn, and, spiritually weak men in their life. And obviously, will subsequent episodes give the male characters more of an opportunity to shine beyond the ability just to shoot a gun? Perhaps, I would assume so, but it's just that such moments are sparse in this initial film. Homestead also just fails to, I think, tell a complete story arc within its runtime. Instead, it spends, most of its time just introducing and establishing story threads and mysteries and conflicts that will only be resolved in later episodes on the streaming app. Because other than an inciting incident of the bombs exploding, which is exciting and I think well done, and also kind of a truncated third act shootout, which is fine, but it's a bit less exciting, there's just a surprisingly, little amount of just dynamic action in this film. I think as a result, the movie can be almost a frustrating experience that feels like an extended commercial for the streaming show without offering enough on its own merit to justify the price of a theatrical movie ticket. But to me, I think what prevents Homestead from being an entirely unsatisfying experience is that while it might feel like a very flashy marketing pitch, I do think it does an effective job for, garnering excitement for the show. I think Homestead does foreshadow kind of an intriguing mix between the gritty social socially conscious tone of, Alex Garland's movie last year, Civil War, and sort of the compelling relational intrigue of something like the hit TV show Lost. I think kind of the setup of a gated community of strangers struggling to work together to survive a post-apocalyptic world is this ripe for future drama and action. And just like everything about Homestead, whether it's the set design or the acting or, the storyline, just feels more naturally suited for, being a good streaming show. I think had I seen this film on the streaming app, I may have been intrigued enough to continue on into episode 2. I should also note that Christians obviously have differing tastes on, intolerances for like how on the nose or how subtle they like the faith aspects conveyed in, a faith-based film. I think for some, the more frequent, the more blunt, the better. As someone personally who has a bit of a weaker stomach for like sermonizing stories, I think Homestead, much like, The Shift, does show that Christians haven't quite cracked the code for how to explore faith through like fictional stories without it coming across, a bit like just a forced Sunday school moment. Because there are plenty of, I think, wholesome messages in Homestead for Christians to affirm. And it is, I think, unquestionably still better written than like the cheesy Christian films of, bygone days. Even so, for me, the messaging is still just jarring and like immersion breaking enough that I always thought like, okay, here's where the filmmakers are incorporating the faith elements rather than feeling like, that it was organic to the characters or the story itself. I think like the religious dialogues were perhaps fine like on their own right, often just felt kind of shoehorned in simply to meet the quota of being a faith-based story rather than always being, what I think the narrative itself called for in that specific moment. But all that said, again, you might feel different about that. I think for Christians who are watching a movie like this for those clear and like unapologetic Christian messages, they will likely appreciate, the agreeable themes and may even wish for a bit more. As far as content to consider, things going on the surface of this, really not a whole lot at all. Language, no like actual profanities, although one character does use like the letter abbreviation BS. And then there's just sort of a scattering of words like crap or heck or dang, but nothing beyond that. Violence, there are several characters in this that are shot, some fatally, but with like a very mild amount of blood visible. And sexuality, nothing in this film for that. As far as themes, worldview, like things going on beneath the surface of this, I think kind of the striking imagery of a largely Christian community set in the middle of a very violent and hostile world can be taken as an intriguing metaphor just, for the church in secular culture, a la Jesus's prayer in John 17 to be in the world but not of the world. I think kind of at the heart of this story is the question of like how to navigate such a tumultuous world. And, should the driving motivation be just self-preservation or should it be, more like a missional call to action? Because in the movie, like the Homestead, I think in a similar way as, the church in the real world must decide whether to like open its arms to all people in need and, just deal with the logical complications from that, that come from that, or to just like close its gates and just try and wait out the storm, like in the safety of their own isolated sanctuary. And as one character in this muses, they say there is life, and then there's life worth living. I think kind of mere survival and like preserving life are just not the same thing as truly living. And in the film, like the leader of the Homestead, which is played by actor Neil McDonough, is fixated on just sort of like what it will cost the community to open its gates to the refugees outside its gates. But he just fails to recognize like the spiritual cost if he does not do so, which just brings to mind, Jesus in Matthew 16:26, where, says like, what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world but forfeits his soul? And in this film's like kind of closing moments, there is a voiceover that I think succinctly kind of articulates the film's, central thematic message, which says survival could have become our North Star, but we chose love instead, and love made life worth living. And with every fall of man and rebirth that follows, love lights the way. So in the end, I think regardless of how Homestead is received, I do think it can be appreciated for taking some very bold, creative swings and offering something fresh in a faith-based genre that, despite vastly, elevated quality, is quickly becoming stale and a bit repetitive. And only time will tell whether giving this film a theatrical release will, stir up enthusiasm and interest in the show, or whether that ambitious strategy will backfire and just leave audiences feeling cheated by paying, full price for a meal only to receive an appetizer. But I think in my own experience, I think think both of those reactions can be true at the same time. I think with a very confident and a distinctive identity, Homestead does demonstrate, the intriguing potential for a streaming show that promises to be unlike really anything else in like the Christian media landscape. I'm just not sure that a theatrical release was the best entry point to invite audiences in to experience it. But hey, I would love to hear what you think. If you, really enjoyed this, if you're really hyped for the show, or if you just sort of felt that it just came across like a big commercial for the show, don't be shy. Jump into the comment section. Let's have a conversation about it. If you haven't done so too, encourage you guys, subscribe to the channel, become a collider, and let's have other movie reviews, got our Faith and Pop Culture podcast, got interviews, just other fun stuff. Would love to have you be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe, have a great Christmas, and continue to collide with your world for Christ.